Russia has dismissed claims that it's been illegally deporting children from former parts of eastern Ukraine, as Moscow points to the need to evacuate minors away from military combat zones. Russia's Children's Rights Commissioner has posted a sarcastic response to The Hague's issuing of arrest warrants for her and President Putin on alleged war crimes charges.
It's great that the international community appreciates the work to help the children of our country. The fact that we don't leave them in war zones, that we evacuate them, create good conditions for them, surround them with loving and caring people.
Null and void. That's how Russia's foreign ministry has branded the International Criminal Court's arrest warrants. Moscow says the move has no legal ramifications for the country as it's not a party to The Hague's international statute. The ICC wants the Russian president and Children's Rights Commissioner in the dock on alleged war crimes charges. The Hague claims the officials are responsible for deporting children, allegations previously voiced by Kiev. The ICC's jurisdiction is not recognised by countries including Russia, China and the US. Here's the reaction from Russia's Foreign Ministry spokeswoman.
Decisions of the International Criminal Court have no significance for our country, including from legal standpoint. Russia is not a participant of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court and has no obligations under the statute. Russia does not cooperate with this body, and possible recipes for arrest from the ICC will be null and void to us.
Austrian Foreign Minister Karin Kneissl now to discuss this further. Many thanks for joining us on the programme this evening. Now, Karin, plenty of countries don't actually recognise The Hague's decisions. That includes Russia, China and even the US. So what's your take on the ramifications of this arrest warrant?
Good evening. Well, there are no ramifications at all due to the fact that the Russian Federation, as you have just pointed out, has not ratified that Rome Statute that went into force in 1995. And from its very early beginning, unfortunately, I must say, the International Crime Court, which was supposed to be something like a subsequent to what we had with the Nuremberg and the Tokyo Tribunal just after World War II, that court has been instrumentalized in a political way from the very beginning. Actually, so far, it was even called by some an African tribunal because it was all about African heads of states, politicians who were indicted and where arrest warrants had been issued. But as we have seen, neither for the war crimes committed on the territory of Iraq. Let us mention here, for instance, what happened in the Abu Ghraib prison, nor for war crimes that, for instance, Julian Assange had been investigating in Afghanistan. There never had been any indictment with regard to commanders, political responsibles who were involved in those actions. So the International Crime Court is highly, but really highly instrumentalized in a political way, and we just witnessed it once more.
Yeah, the Hague's claims are based on allegations made from the Ukrainian government, which Moscow has strongly denied. Why do you think the ICC is playing along with Kiev's side of the story before any independent international probe has even taken place? And how concerning is that to you?
Well, the Ukrainian government had been pushing for that by also establishing a sort of special court in Ukraine to have alleged war criminals tried on the Ukrainian territory. We have seen the European Commission being very active in that. I remember that President von der Leyen had been pushing for such an indictment, for such a warrant, ever since mid-December. So things had been accumulating for the past months. And my take on that is that Chief Prosecutor Karin, who is a British citizen, and I would say he was reluctant. He was really very reluctant to become operative, but he had been put under tremendous pressure. And this pressure, I assume, came maybe more from his own government than from Ukraine.
This ICC arrest warrant certainly sets a precedent, as heads of state usually enjoy diplomatic immunity. So to what extent is this move even in line with international law in the first place?
Well, the International Crime Court had been developed, I would say, by eminent legal scholars, but of course, there always was the concern by various governments which are active abroad, and here first and foremost it was really the US, that had been opposing the crime court, and that in a very, very special, nasty way, I would say. Let me go back to the late 1990s, when then we had the NATO enlargement of 1999. New NATO member states, such as Romania, Hungary, etc., they were forced by the US into a non-extradition commitment regarding US citizens. So the US was, from the very early days when it came to the crime court, very much concerned that any of its citizens might be tried. So the crime court had a rather unlucky history from the very beginning. I would say it has come into the Rome Statute is based on international law. There's nothing to contradict on that. But it was always instrumentalized for political reasons, and it has become operative only in a highly selective way. And if I may go back a little bit into history, what is interesting is that this whole topic of the Hague Law, what we call international law regarding war crimes, warfare as such. Actually, it was an idea that the Russian Tsar, Nicholas II, that Russian scholars had been developing in the early 20th century. So whatever we had seen in terms of creating important norms regarding warfare, that was done at St. Petersburg conferences in early 20th century. And it was a rather important concept that is now used in a very selective way against the Russian officials, which is surreal.
Well, the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, he says the ICC warrant will not stop him from meeting with President Putin. Do you expect any other world leaders to take a similar stance?
Yes, I think this is a very important statement, because I don't see, I mean, we have on Monday the Chinese President Xi Jinping will do his state visit to Moscow, and we will see definitely President Putin also travel abroad, whether it's for bilateral or multilateral purposes. So I would say it's a very unfortunate action by the ICC, and it only fosters this loss of trust that we have between the so-called collective West and Moscow, and it doesn't advance anything. I mean, there is just again, I repeat myself, it's a political instrumentalization of a court that is anyway facing lots of problems because it had been completely opposed, mocked, suppressed, in particular by the US government over the last 2 decades.
The EU Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell says the Hague's move is the start of an accountability process for Russia. But what about accountability for Ukraine and its Western sponsors?
Yes, exactly. I mean, there's the war, as we know, started in 2014, and it's all about the many perpetrators that we have seen. And what is interesting, I mean, we know still too little about the motivations, the papers that the chief prosecutor Karin has been submitting, but it all turns around the topic of the so-called deportation of Ukrainian children, which is due to the fact that many of these children have become victims of the war in the eastern part of Ukraine ever since 2014. So when it comes to warfare as such, when it comes to other aspects here, the ICC has no jurisdiction at all, and there will be a day, once we have something like a ceasefire, an armistice, there will be a day when many alleged suspected perpetrators of crimes will have to be investigated. So this holds true for Ukrainian officials definitely as well.
Well, you know, to this day, no Western officials have been held accountable for the war crimes committed during their invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, for example. Why is that? And how is that not being widely seen as a double standard?
Yes, definitely. It's a triple standard, if you want. And as I mentioned before, and I mean, we had ample evidence also by not only Julian Assange, who had done that via WikiLeaks, but let us also recall Seymour Hersh. He was the first one to report on the crimes perpetrated in US-controlled prison camps, such as Abu Ghraib in spring 2004. Not to speak of the destruction of cultural heritage, what happened in Baghdad exactly 20 years ago. It started the invasion, and there were many statements also by the late UN Secretary General Kofi Annan about the violation of the UN Charter by those who invaded in Iraq back in March 2003. And yes, nothing has happened on that. I mean, books were written, legal opinions were given, but the ICC never ever became active. The former chief prosecutor, who is a lady from Gambia, Mrs. Fatou Bensouda, she had been trying to turn the ICC into a little bit of broader jurisdiction by also referring to crimes happening in the Middle East. But she was put under tremendous, but really tremendous pressure by US government. So there were efforts, but let me remind you that I think it was about 2 years ago, the US government even said no visas, no travel permissions for ICC officials towards the US. So tremendous degree of instrumentalization of this International Crime Court.
When it comes to the timing of this ICC warrant, it's quite interesting. It really coming, just days ahead of the Chinese president's much anticipated visit to Moscow. Do you think the visit will be affected? And also, do you think there's a message trying to be sent here from the West to Beijing and other countries that have close ties with Russia?
Could be. I wouldn't exclude that it's not a mere coincidence that today on Friday evening that was issued. Because as far as I have been observing over the last few months, the chief prosecutor, Karin was really reluctant. I mean, he was put under pressure. There were noisy statements by various officials, but I had the impression he was not too eager to act. That it happened today, just 48 hours before the Chinese president is doing his state visit in Moscow, might not be a mere coincidence, but I would say in the long run it doesn't advance anything on what we really need, which is some sort of getting back to speaking terms.
Thank you so much for discussing this with us this evening. We really appreciate your time and your insight. Former Austrian Foreign Minister Karin Kneissl.